So Folio is thrilled to host Nancy Pearl and Jeff Schwager this evening. And I want to begin with just a personal anecdote of my experience with Nancy. When I was at the University of Washington in library school, my entire cohort could not wait for 2 classes in the entire 2-year program. Those 2 classes were taught by Nancy Pearl, Reader's Advisory and a Genre Study. It was the kind of class where if you didn't sit at your computer on the day that you registered for the class, you wouldn't make it and you'd have to wait till the next quarter. It was that popular and that eagerly anticipated. And it exceeded all of our expectations. The class was magnificent. Both classes were magnificent. And somebody wrote on the whiteboard outside the door, best class on the planet. So Nancy is hero and mentor to librarians and librarians to be everywhere. So, and Nancy is a well-known and well-regarded advocate for the importance of reading and the shared conversation around books. As you may know, Nancy is the founder of the Common Book phenomenon that is now practiced all across the country and all over the world. It began right here in Seattle in 1998 with a library program, brainchild of Nancy Pearl, called If All of Seattle Read the Same Book, wisely shortened now to Seattle Reads.
Right.
So that was Nancy. Nancy was the founder and the creator. In her continuing effort to promote books and reading, Nancy has also traveled internationally to Australia for the Sydney Writers' Festival on one trip, and a second time across the entire country, state by state. She has been to Estonia, Cambodia. She traveled to Bosnia for a Common Read program in high schools that used Sherman Alexie's book, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, for their Common Read. And most recently, she was asked to present at the International Book Festival of Peru. Nancy Pearl is indeed tireless in her devotion to books and reading. Her other accomplishments include regular appearances on NPR's Morning Edition and KWGS-FM Tulsa, where she offers book recommendations. She has a monthly television show on the Seattle channel called Book Lust, which features interviews with authors, poets, and other literary figures. And if this isn't enough, Nancy is a best-selling author as well. She has written numerous texts for the American Library Association on Reader's Advisory, which is essentially how to put the right book in the right hand at the right time. Nancy is a master. Her Book Lust series was a huge hit, and it included Book Lust, more Book Lust, Book Lust for Children, and Book Lust for Travelers. I think there may be a theme here. These books contain lists of books for every type of reader and on a variety of subjects. And her book prior to this one, entitled George and Lizzie, was her incredible debut novel. This evening, Nancy is here with her new book, The Writer's Library, co-authored with Jeff Schwager. The Writer's Library is a revelatory exploration of the studies, the libraries, and the bookstores of 23 of today's living literary legends who reveal the books that made them think, brought them joy, changed their lives, and informed the writers they became. It is a true love letter to readers, a celebration of the power of the written word, and a treasure trove of books that we'll all want to add to our own libraries. Please join me in welcoming Nancy Pearl.
Oh, Lillian, you're too kind. You're just too kind. I'm just blushing, and I won't stop blushing this whole thing. So let me introduce the other, my good friend and partner on in the project, The Writer's Library. And Jeff Schwager has done many things in his life. What he's probably best known in Seattle for is his work as a playwright. He adapted Michael Chabon's Cavalier and Clay for Book It, and probably no other person would have taken that job on. And it ended up as a really remarkable 5-hour presentation for book at audiences, and won an award that year, which Jeff could tell us about if he wants to. He also adapted Dennis Johnson's novel, oh my God, Jesus' Son. Sorry, Jesus' Son. I'm always block on that novel for Jeff, because during the course of our interviews, there were two authors that whenever there was a space in the conversation, like whenever the authors would take a little breath, before they were going to start something else, Jeff would always bring up his two favorite writers, one of whom was Philip Roth and the other was Dennis Johnson. So, and the whole idea for the Writers' Library was Jeff's. So I'm going to let him, is that okay, Lillian?
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to bring him on and let him talk about where the idea came from.
Yeah. My first question.
Yes.
Would you like to ask the question before I answer?
Yeah, sure. What was the inspiration to the Writers' Library, Jeff?
Well, I met Nancy when I was curating a project for the Washington State Jewish Historical Society called Agents of Change, 20 Remarkable Jewish Women of Washington State. And Nancy and I hit it off right away and started hanging out together and having lunch and talking about books. And I had this title in my head for a while, The Writers' Library, with the idea of interviewing writers about the books that were in their libraries. And it would be a coffee table book with a lot of photos of their actual books and the inscriptions on their books and their favorite books and their bookshelves and everything. And as I got to know Nancy and felt secure enough in our friendship that I didn't think it would hurt our friendship to ask her if she'd be willing to work on this with me, I did ask her, and she immediately said no. She wasn't interested in doing a coffee table book, but that if I would consider doing it as a book of just interviews, she would be interested in doing it. And so that's what we decided to pitch to first Nancy's agent, and eventually Nancy's agent pitched it to publishers, and I'll let Nancy pick it up from there.
Okay.
So my agent, Victoria Sanders, the first thing she said, because I presented both ideas, the coffee table idea and the book of interviews, and she said, not a coffee table book. No, Nancy, that is not your brand. That's the big word. She said, but a book of interviews would be wonderful. And she said, what we'd like you to do is do 10 sample interviews, and then we'll use that to I'll take that out to publishers. And I said, there is no way that we're going to do 10 interviews. That's ridiculous. The whole book is not going to be more than, we thought at that time about 20 to 25 interviews. Said, we're not going to do 10 interviews, but we'll do 3, and they'll be so good, you'll love them, and the publishers will love them. So the first interview that we did is actually the first interview in the book, and it was with Jonathan Lethem, and he happened to be in Seattle. His book, The Feral Detective, had just come out, and he was going to be at Elliott Bay in the evening, and we interviewed him in the late afternoon, so late in the afternoon, and he was so generous with his time that finally I said, well, we need to stop because you need to get ready to go over to the bookstore. And we knew, well, and then the second interview we did was with Charles Johnson, of course, the author of, among many other books now, Middle Passage, which won the National Book Award. And the third author that we did was Lori Frankel, whose books are so wonderfully warm and character-driven, and we wanted to give, just a wide range in these 3 authors. And once we did Jonathan, once we did Charles Johnson, and certainly by the time we had done Lori's, Jeff and I were pretty sure first of all, we had a blast doing all those interviews. I mean, they were so much fun. And I think also we felt that they revealed things about these writers that you don't get in an ordinary interview. And in fact, we sent all the writers finished copies of the book, and almost immediately got an email from Jonathan Lethem that said, I just read my interview, and I want you to know that it really shows me shows me as I really am, in a way that many other interviews never do. So, I think it's because we were talking to them. Well, I'll just say one more thing, and then we didn't go in. We had no set list of questions. I think that was really important, and we didn't send out, because we had no set list of questions. We never sent out a list of questions to the authors. Right. Jeff and I really saw this as a chance for two people who love to read and who agree about lots of books and disagree about lots of books, but two people who love to read talking to someone else, the author, who loves to read. So, the interviews generally begin with me asking, did they grow up in a reading family, or that kind of a question. But after that, each writer just took us in whatever direction he or she or they wanted to go and we just followed along and asked, tried to bring out as much as we could of the author's story and of the books that they'd loved, read and loved their whole lives.
How did you come up with the list of the rest of the authors? How did you create that list? Did you have criteria? Did you? I'm sure you collaborated, but how did you ultimately come up with the rest of the people, the rest of the authors that you interviewed?
Jeff, you say.
Well, there were 20 more writers after we did the initial 3. We each came up with our own list of people that we really wanted to interview. And the first thing we did was anyone who was on both lists, we were going to try and get them.
Okay.
And there were probably, 10, 12 people on both of our lists. And then the people who were on one of our lists, we sort of, whoever's list they were on, made the case for why that person would be a good person to include. And we came to Nancy says, we didn't come to fisticuffs. We didn't even have raised voices, but we had some heated conversations about it. I wouldn't even say that they were heated. They were excited conversations about why we loved this writer or that writer and why we would like to interview them. Mm-hmm. So it was for me a very pleasurable process coming up with the list. I mean, I love coming up with lists in general, and for the most part, people that we wanted to interview, this is one of the great advantages of having Nancy involved in the project, is that people want to talk to Nancy about books. A great example of that is Amor Towles. We were at the very end of the process, and I had not read Amor Towles, and then I read his first novel, the title of which is now escaping me. Nancy?
Rules of Civility.
Rules of Civility.
Rules of Civility, of course. And I just fell in love with it. And then I read A Gentleman in Moscow, and I loved it even more. And I said, Nancy, you think there's any way we could interview Amor? And she said, well, we could give it a try. So I went and looked at his website to see who his publicist was, and there was a contact form on his website. Mm-hmm. And so I just wrote a note on his contact form, and by the next day, he had written back saying yes. And it was that kind of experience. The no's were generally, Toni Morrison declined because she was in ill health. Alice Munro declined because she has retired from writing and is no longer doing interviews. Philip Roth declined because he died. And
fortunately.
Yeah, that really bummed me out. But he is my favorite writer. But mostly people were excited to do it. There were a couple of people. Tobias Wolff we really wanted to do, and he was finishing a book and said, check back with me next fall, and I should be done with my book. And if you're still working on your book then, I can do it. But unfortunately, we had already finished by then. Right. And Lori Moore said she was not doing in-person interviews, but she would do an email interview. And at that time, we were hoping that every interview would be in person.
Right.
As it turned out, every interview but one was in person, and that was Donna Tartt, who at the very end, we had not been able to arrange an in-person interview, although she was willing to do it. But anyway, we decided that it was so important to us to have Donna in the book that we would do an email interview with her. And in retrospect, we certainly feel the same way about Lori Moore. And if we ever do a second volume, we will do Lori Moore via email.
Yeah, great. And you went to all the authors' homes and sat with them in their own home, in their own library.
Yeah. The majority of the authors, we did go to their homes. Louise Erdrich, we interviewed in Minneapolis, suburb of Minneapolis, in her bookstore, Birch Bark Books, which was a real treat for us to see the bookstore. Louise Zurea, whose interview is one of just a lovely interview in the book, funny and warm, and it's just him to a T. He and his wife were coming from Oregon and going back home to the Midwest, and so we caught up with him in a hotel room in Portland, and interviewed him there.
It saved us a trip to Chicago.
Right, yes. Yeah. And then Maza Mengista, who lives in New York, and we made a couple of trips to New York to interview those New York writers. We interviewed Maza at the Center for Fiction, which is a library / bookstore in Brooklyn. And she had just, she had a display of rare photographs from Ethiopia, Italian photographs that she had picked up of people during the Italian-Ethiopian conflict, which is what she writes about. So we interviewed her there. Yeah. And I think everybody else was pretty much at home.
Pretty much, yeah. There were a couple of others who were in oddball places, I think.
Really?
But yeah, almost everyone was at home. And yeah, that one of Maza's was great because those photos were what she used to inspire herself when she was writing The Shadow King, which is now shortlisted for the Booker Prize.
Yeah, right.
And she said that she was looking at those photos as she was trying to imagine the sort of women warriors who were defending Ethiopia from the Italian invasion. So it was amazing to see those photos and have her sort of walk us through that exhibit.
Yeah, I bet. And T.C. Boyle has a unique abode. You went to his home. You can talk a little bit about that.
So T.C. Boyle, or as we call him now, Tom, when we first emailed, both Jeff and I had interviewed T.C. Boyle years and years ago. And of course, he didn't remember either one of us, but we wrote to say, would you be willing to be interviewed for this book? And he wrote back pretty much immediately and said, yes, what fun we will have! ! So T.C. Boyle lives in a Frank Lloyd Wright prairie style home in Montecito, California, which he's written about for the New Yorker. And so we don't feel funny saying where it is or anything like that because he talks about where it is. But so here's an example, like Jeff and I, we just got along great on all these trips and everything, and everything was going fine. But when we got to T.C. Boyle's house, there was a door. It's like a fenced compound kind of, and there was a doorbell that you were supposed to ring to announce yourself. And just like we were like 4 years old, we had a little spat about who was going to ring the doorbell. And Jeff kept saying, "You ring the doorbell, Nancy. He'll know who you are." And I kept saying, "Jeff, you ring the doorbell. You ring the doorbell." And so we're standing there, sort of just in this little power struggle of like, I guess not 4-year-olds, 8-year-olds, I'll say. And
can I just interject here that it's like, I'm saying, "You're America's librarian. He'll know who you are." And she's like, "Oh, you're taller than me. You ring the doorbell."
Right. And then while we're in the midst of this, the gate opens and T.C. Boyle, who is like 6'6", towers over us, comes out, and because the doorbell doesn't work. And so that was a good start to the interview. And then he was just wonderful. He let us take pictures of his house, and, we followed him around and looked at the books on his bookshelf, and we would talk about, I would say, "Oh my gosh, I love that book, The Maples Family," John Updike's book about the marriage, about the Maples marriage. Or one of my favorite books, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, was on Richard Ford's, Tom Boyle's shelf as well. I mean, it was that kind of thing that we both, I think, and he loved it too. He had put a picnic out for us on one of the porches, and we just talked about books. And what's better than to sit around with somebody who's read a lot and loves to talk about books.
Yeah, which is what writers love to do, I think, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
What did you have to do any research for any of the authors, or background work, or did you relied on your inherent knowledge of individual writers and authors?
Well, I think that was certainly Nancy, for the most part, relied on her inherent knowledge. There were several writers that I was not familiar with when Nancy first pitched them as possibilities, and I would read up on them, and I would read at least one of their books, because I think that's really important. A lot of journalists will interview somebody cold without reading their stuff, but I've always found that to be a really disrespectful way to walk into an interview not knowing somebody's work. So I would, try to read up on everybody that we were interviewing. I think Nancy had probably read something by everybody that we ended up interviewing.
Yeah.
And a lot of people you interviewed yourself at some time or another, Nancy. Is that true?
Most of the people, many of the people I had, yes, already interviewed. And Jeff had already interviewed in a previous existence as a journalist, interviewed many of the authors too. But I'm not sure anybody remembered, except Luis Urrea remembered.
Certainly no one remembered me. In fact, we walked into Michael Chabon and Ayelet Waldman's house, and as Nancy said, I adapted The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay for Book It, but I never. Michael was not able to come to the production. He was back east when that production went on, so I didn't see him there. And in fact, I had interviewed him when his very first book came out in 1988, The Mysteries of Pittsburgh. So we walk into the house, and Michael's like, "So who are you? Why are we doing this interview?" And I said, "Well, actually, I did this thing for Book It, and I actually interviewed you when The Mysteries of Pittsburgh came out." And he's not that there's any reason you to remember that. You've probably done 1,000 interviews since then. He said, "Oh yeah, back in those days, I was still trying to figure out if I needed to wear a tie at interviews or not. I really didn't know what I was doing."
Yes. Michael and Ayelet were just a writer couple that you interviewed, and I'm sure that was a unique experience.
Well, yeah, we had wanted to interview writing couples as together, because we thought it would be really interesting to see them play off each other, and whether, we were interested in whether they read the same books, whether there were books that they disagreed about, all that kind of thing. So we had planned to interview Venda Levita and Dave Eggers together, and we're in California, and at the last minute, I guess there was illness in Vendela's family, and so we had to do those two interviews separately. And for many people who've read the book, that interview with Ayelet and Michael is one of the high points of the whole book, partly because you not only get to see them as writers and as readers, but you really get an insight into their relationship, into their marriage, which appears, from all that we could see, is a pretty great relationship.
And as Nancy always reminds me, I'm a very nosy person, and one of the reasons I was interested in interviewing literary couples was that I just wanted to see how they would interact together. And there were a couple of others that we were hoping to do, but we weren't able to for one reason or another. And so maybe, again, if we do another book, there will definitely be at least one other couple that we interview, and hopefully more.
I like the one question you asked the Michael and Ayelet about what they wish they had written. What is the book you wish you had written? And you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, to me, that's one of the sweetest things about the interview, because Ayelet said that if she could have written Cavalier and Clay, it would have made her life complete if she had had the talent to do that.
That was very sweet. It was.
And actually, she is now working on Cavalier and Clay. She and Michael are adapting it into a long-form television series for Showtime. So she's getting to work on it.
Oh, well, that's a nice result. Did you have any say about the order of the interviews and how they appeared in the book? Like Jonathan was the first interview, and he was the first one. But what about the other interviews? Did you have a say in how they were ordered? Because I know Russell is the last one.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we did. Our editor had a kind of a list that she gave us, and we came back with a list of our own, and she ended up just going with the list as we gave it to her. As they appear in the book, they're alternating between men and women.
Okay.
And that was intentional, just because we wanted to emphasize the fact that there were an equal number of men and women in the book. I think that's women often get short shrift in these sorts of literary roundups, I think, and hopefully that's less the case now than it used to be. But we wanted to make a point that we were interviewing an equal number of men and women. I think actually we ended up interviewing one more woman than man in the book. So, and we ended with Russell because Russell ended his interview with a great summation in a way. And Russell, I believe, is the oldest of the subjects in the book. And it just felt right that it would end with him, also because of his history with Nancy. That felt like a great way to a great summing up.
Yeah.
He talked about how he knows that he's at the sort of tail end of his writing career, and now he's taking the time to reread Tolstoy because that's what's important to him now. Yeah. And I thought that was really powerful.
Right. When I talked about, is there an echo? Are you guys hearing an echo? No?
We did at in the first part of that sentence, but now it's gone.
Okay, well, I hope it doesn't continue. But when I mentioned about Seattle Reads and the Nancy being the inspiration for that, Russell Banks was the very first Seattle Reads presenter with the Sweet Hereafter, the very first and the very best.
I don't know. Ernest Gaines was pretty wonderful too.
He was.
And Bill Moyers was wonderful.
Oh my gosh, he was wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I read that last paragraph that Russell said? So this is how the book ends, and this is how Russell Banks's interview with us ended. There's the first stage in your career when you hope you're going to get a grant or a prize or something like that. Then there's the second stage. If you are lucky enough to get 1 or 2 or 3 along the way, you end up being asked to be a juror, and you're sitting on the juries for a while. And then there's a stage at the end where you say, I don't want to sit on a jury. I'm not applying for any more grants or prizes. I've probably won what I'm going to win. Then you kind of withdraw and you read the stories of Tolstoy instead. Now, just that paragraph, that's exactly what he said. We have it on tape. And you can see what a wonderful writer he is. I mean, these interviews, we recorded, it's not tape anymore. We recorded all the interviews, and usually the interviews lasted really between an hour and a half and 2 hours, I think. And at the end of like 2 hours, I would have to kick Jeff and, try to do it so the author wouldn't notice. And I would say, come on, stop talking. Because they were giving us all this, they're so generous with their time. And then, so we had all of this material, and then we had to transcribe it. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that was, for me, the hardest part of this whole project was trying to transcribe these interviews.
The one interview that Nancy transcribed was the hardest part of this project.
It was. Well, it was. I mean, I tried to transcribe Charles Johnson's interview, which was so interesting. And you transcribe by listening, and then you try to put the words down. Well, I mean, I was ready to give up. I mean, I was done. And then I was interviewing Erica Bauermeister, another wonderful Washington writer, Seattle writer, and was telling Erica about my problems with this transcription issue, this whole transcription issue. And Erica said, well, I know somebody who might be interested in doing it. Her son's girlfriend who worked at Finney Books. And so we got in touch with Annika. And to me, we owe her the book. I mean, if it weren't for Annika's transcriptions, I don't know what we would have done. I mean, Jeff, maybe he could have done it, but there's no way that I could have done it. And so then we had the transcriptions, and then Jeff and I worked on condensing them and trying to take the best of each interview to make a cohesive kind of work.
Right.
And then we sent it. And the way we did that is one of us did the first go round of cutting the interview down and, picking out the stuff that we thought was important. And then the other person would go over it and, make changes. And we didn't have any disagreements about that. I don't think, Jeff, that was pretty seamless. And then we sent the interviews, what we saw as the finished interviews, to each of the writers. And Jeff, you made the point that that's different from the way a journalist would work. I thought that was really interesting. You should talk about that.
Yeah, well, a journalist is, first, journalists have a certain code of ethics where they are not supposed to sort of show things to the subject before it's published. Mm-hmm. For whatever reason. You're not supposed to allow the subject to influence your work. And also journalists are generally looking for some sort of hook, some sort of scoop, something that no one else has ever gotten. And that's not what we were after. I mean, by the very dint of our subject, we were going to get things that no one else had gotten, because we were spending the entirety of the interview talking about the books they'd read, which is normally a very brief section of an interview with a writer. So we knew we were going to get things no one else had. But what we were really after was getting to the heart of who they were as readers and what was really important to them. And to find out what was important to them, it was great to be able to collaborate with them and send it to them and have them say, well, you know, I said this maybe in the spur of the moment, but, you know, I said this was my favorite Edith Wharton book, but on deeper consideration, this is my favorite Edith Wharton book, or something like that. You know, we could really get the right answer as opposed to what, you know, what comes off the top of someone's head. And that was a really rewarding experience for me as somebody who'd worked as a journalist and done it the other way for so many years.
And we were, I mean, it's really, you know, it's when somebody says, well, what's your favorite book? That's a hard, you know, I mean, that's a hard question. And
not for me.
Right, not for Jeff. But, you know, and one of the writers emailed us and said, oh my gosh, I forgot these books that I really wanted to talk about. And that's exactly the thing that we hoped would happen by sending them the interviews. And then they sent the interviews back and we made the changes, and then it became this beautiful book.
Beautiful book. Were there a lot of changes or not too many?
It depended on the writer, right?
Yeah.
I mean, some writers, I would say there were never a lot of changes. Some writers really felt that they needed to add things, or they needed to just rewrite sentences to make it sound more smoother as for the reader. But many of the writers just said, I think, you know, it's fine. You know, go with it.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the writers wanted it to read like a piece of their writing, and others were more comfortable with a conversational tone. But my favorite story for that is going back again to Michael Chabon and Ayelet Waldman. We sent them the interview, and Ayelet rewrote her sections quite a bit and sent it back to us, copied Michael on the note saying, I edited mine, I left yours completely alone, and we never heard from Michael. So Michael's answers were exactly as we edited them, and Ayelet's, she did some fine tuning, which was great. You know, that's how they wanted it. And, you know, Michael is the sort of person who I think, you know, he's won a Pulitzer Prize. He doesn't care what anyone thinks about how smart he is. Basically, I think, you know, he's incredibly confident about that. And Ayelet is perhaps, you know, more interested in presenting a certain picture. And that's what we want. We want people to present themselves as they wish to be presented.
Yeah. And you said something about my favorite book, or this isn't my favorite book. I want this to be my favorite book. The list at the end of each interview is books that they talked about during the interview that have impressed them. Was there a lot of crossover in those books, or were there recurrent themes or recurrent books that went through a lot of the interviews?
Well, I think the author who I think was mentioned most by most of the writers, greatest number of the writers, was Lori Moore.
Okay.
And as we said, I mean, Jeff and I both are in strong agreement that Lori Moore is one of the great short story writers of our time. So that was not really a surprise. But I think what came as a surprise, both to me and Jeff, were the number of writers who talked about how much they had loved Watership Down by Richard Adams. And these authors ranged from Madeline Miller, author of Circe and The Song of Achilles, to Michael Chabon, who read that book to his kids. You sort of got the impression he read it to all four of the kids separately, so he'd read it 4 times. And Madeline Miller, this was so interesting to me that Madeline Miller read Watership Down at about the same time that she was learning Greek and Latin in school, and she reads Watership Down as a kind of, like her novels, as a kind of heroic journey. Mm-hmm. And she in her interview, she talks about reading the last 100 pages of Watership Down, and how she just was so involved and just so taken with it. It was really a pretty wonderful response to a novel that a lot of people would probably dismiss as a little book about rabbits.
Mm-hmm. And Andrew Sean Greer is another writer who mentioned Watership Down, and he said that one of my favorite questions to ask people was there a book that you read that made you realize you wanted to be a writer, that made you feel like, this is my tribe, these are my people, this is how I can contribute to the world? And Andy said he didn't know if there was a book like that, but that when he first read Watership Down was when he first realized that somebody was writing these books and making a conscious effort to achieve effects. And he talked about some specific imagery that is in the beginning of the book in the spring, and then it's, it recurs but totally different in the fall. And that made him realize that this writer really knew what they were doing and had planned this out, and that had a really strong impact on him.
Yeah. I noticed that list. When you look at a list like that, or a bunch of lists, the books that pop out to you are the ones that you like. Mm-hmm. It just happens.
Yeah.
So I did notice Toni Morrison showed up a lot on a lot of the lists.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Edith Wharton. And James Baldwin.
Yes.
Uh-huh. James Baldwin. Yes.
Yes. And I wonder if not only is this these lists are wonderful for readers, but they're also sort of books for people who are aspiring writers as well. Books that people who want to write should read. Do you think that?
I think, I think that one of the things about the Writer's Library is that it's a book about people who love to read, but it's also a book about how people who are writers use books to learn how to be better writers.
Right.
And I was reminded of something, in the course of doing these interviews, I was reminded again and again of something Ernest Gaines said when he came to Seattle in 1999 as the second of the If All Seattle Read the Same Book, for his book, A Lesson Before Dying. But somebody asked him at one of the public programs, do you have any advice for writers? And he said, yeah, I have 8 words of advice. Read, 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 write, 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 write. Mm-hmm. And I think that that writers, this didn't come out in all of the interviews, but it certainly came out in some, that writers use reading to help themselves get better.
Yeah.
They use reading in a different way that a non-writer uses reading. Do you think that's fair, Jeff?
I do, and actually, I've never associated this thought with this before, but I'm reminded of something that Bob Dylan once said about when people ask him how do I become a great songwriter like you? He says, listen to the stuff that I listened to when I was coming up. Listen to Robert Johnson and the blues, listen to Hank Williams, listen to Woody Guthrie, don't listen to me. And I think that's true with writers as well. When you see that Jennifer Egan's favorite writer of all time is Edith Wharton, that that is what has, that's the food that has enriched her writing life and made her the writer that she is. And again, one of the great stories that is in the book is Amor Towles talking about this book group that he founded with 3 friends. The 4 of them have been doing it, I think, for 16 years now. And they read very deeply into one author or one subject. And, he gave us some of the things that he had read. What was the wonderful when he had 19th century
women under, it was 19th century wives under pressure.
Yes.
Portrait of a Lady, Middlemarch, and Madame Bovary.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I just read, actually, speaking of Madame Bovary, I just read a wonderful quote from Madame Bovary, which I can't get out of my head, which is, she wanted to die, but she also wanted to live in Paris. I mean, I just, that's like the best.
That's how we all feel now, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Jeff, I wanted to, Amor Towles actually talks a lot about the writing process and why he reads and what he does when he reads. He underlines, he makes notes, he tracks the patterns and the motifs that emerge. I mean, he's a reader.
And a writer.
And a writer. Yeah. But, there was a question, Jeff, you asked Siri Husfeld that I thought was really, really poignant. And you asked her, who do you think writing today is more likely to outlast our time? Mm. And her answer was incredible. May I read it?
Sure.
Okay. She says, we can't know. Writers celebrated in their time often vanish. Think of Booth Tarkington. What looked brilliant then seems mediocre now. American literary consensus has often tended toward the midland. Women disappear because they are women. Some have been revived. Eliza Haywood is now in the 18th century English canon. Sexual prejudice and race prejudice have frequently been roots to oblivion. Zora Neale Hurston, famous in her time, fell into obscurity but is now deservedly canonized. When the New York Times published 100 years of its reviews, they couldn't find a decent review of Faulkner. The review of Dostoevsky was an embarrassment, marked by British-style snobbery about Russian emotionality. Nothing has changed.
Well, that gives you a wonderful picture of Siri Hustvedt as well. Siri Hustvedt, I think, is one of the most intelligent women I won't even say women, one of the most intelligent, brilliant people that I've ever met. And the opportunity to talk with her, that was a hard interview to work with because there was so much there, and because, we had to cut it, and Jeff did the first, that was one where Jeff did the first cutting and working on it. And I remember him texting me and saying, this is really hard because there is so much here. Yeah. She was amazing to interview.
Yeah, I mean, she's just a brilliant woman. She teaches at the psychiatry school of Cornell, was it?
Yeah, Cornell Weill.
Yeah. I mean, she's just, so on top of being a brilliant novelist, a brilliant essayist. I mean, she's an amazing nonfiction writer. She writes about art. She's written about feminist issues, and she's written about her own challenges with illness in a way that, I can't think of a writer other than Susan Sontag who's written about illness so powerfully.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, if anybody hasn't read Siri Hustvedt, I think that a wonderful novel of hers to start with is The Blazing World, in which all of her concerns and her interests come to bear, are evident in that novel. Have you read that, Lillian?
I haven't, but I'm putting it on my list.
Yeah, you must read it. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and she is half of a couple that would have been nice to have a whole couple.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Can I say that the other half of the couple, we heard coughing upstairs.
Paul Auster is her husband, for the people who don't know. Yeah.
Yes, and Nancy has interviewed Paul Auster on her television show, in fact.
Yeah, I was there.
Yes.
Yeah. Were there any surprises or highlights of the entire time? Everything was marvelous. Everything was wonderful. But anything stand out?
I mean, there was so many highlights. You know, Tom Boyle's house was a big highlight, and I loved Amor Towles' den. He just had the quintessential writer's den. It was dark wood bookshelves, floor to ceiling with high ceilings, and first editions behind glass of old 19th century rare books.
Wow.
You know, in a beautiful part of New York, and it was just sitting in that den made me so envious.
I think what I loved, I mean, I just think about certain parts of interviews that are so meaningful and so interesting. Russell Banks talking about how he was such a he was this kid who never behaved in school, and the teachers didn't want him in their classes, and how Mrs. Doherty in the fourth grade really turned him into a reader. You know, that kind of thing. I just remember it just was so wonderful. And Luis Urrea talking about both his growing up as the child of a Mexican father and an American mother, and being born in Tijuana and crossing the border back and forth as his parents really fought over him about whether he would be Mexican or American. And the way that played out to a certain extent was through the books that they wanted him to read. But then Ursula Le Guin was really a mentor to Luis Urrea, and was the reason that his first work was published. And there's a wonderful part in the interview, I don't want to give it away, but there's a wonderful part in the interview where Luis Urrea talks about a piece of advice that Ursula gave him, and she would call him Luisito, and she'd say, Luisito, you mustn't do this. And so it's things like that I just good
advice for every male writer.
Yes, right.
Ursula gave him. I'll throw out another one. Was Laila Lalami's going to her home, and she lives 2 blocks from where I grew up in Santa Monica, California.
Oh.
So it was great to see my old neighborhood where I spent my childhood, but just talking to her about her experience as a Moroccan, as a girl in Morocco, caught between French and Moroccan cultures and reading, and then also with the English influence in there, and then coming to America, and we talked to her about Paul Bowles, who was an American writer who relocated to Morocco. And we saw she had Paul Bowles' collected stories on her shelf. So, we said, well, what do you think of Paul Bowles? And she said, well, it's amazing that somebody could live in a country for 40 years and not understand the people at all. That was a moment that really stuck with me. And then after that interview, I got to take Nancy to the deli that I used to go to when I was a kid in Santa Monica.
It was still there?
Lunch. It was still there, yeah.
And the other thing about Laila's interview, which we found too when we interviewed Viet Thanh Nguyen, was one of the books that, I mean, colonialism always came up, of course, with them, and the importance to them of Edward Said's book Orientalism.
Right.
So it was these interviews still, when I think about them and think about the individual writers and what we learned from them and the books that they talked about, it was just a pretty remarkable
Yeah, it's awful to leave someone out. To leave anyone out. There's something associated with every writer in this book that's a treasure to us personally. I mean, Dave Eggers, we interviewed at the McSweeney's Quarterly Concern offices. That's his literary quarterly. But it's right across the street from 826 Valencia, which is the nonprofit literacy organization that he's founded and which is in cities across the country. And he took us over there and showed us around. And, we spent a lot of time talking to Dave about all the wonderful work he's done with nonprofits. And it was really inspiring to hear how he has taken his gift as a writer and shared it with the world. Yes. And used it as entree to improve the world in other ways that have nothing really to do with being a writer, but just making the world a better place. What an impressive guy he is.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask about the illustrations. What was the decision to not have photographs, but to have these glorious, I don't know if you can see it, glorious illustrations?
Donna.
Yeah.
That was our editor, Tara Parsons.
Okay.
It was her idea, and I think, she was the woman who was my editor for George and Lizzie. So I had enormous faith in what in Tara's opinions, and she changed publishers and came to HarperCollins, which is how Harper One, part of HarperCollins, which is why this book is published by Harper One. Yeah. So it was her idea.
Yeah, they're beautiful, and they're almost more powerful in that little drawn, sketched look. So I think that was a good choice.
Good.
Yeah. Nancy, you love poetry as much as you love literature. Is there a possibility of a poets library?
Oh, Jeff and I were talking. Jeff loves poetry as well.
Okay.
And, one of the people in the book that we interviewed is Jane Hirschfield. That was the one poet that we did. I really regret we couldn't interview more poets. And Jeff and I have talked about doing a poets library. I think that would be great.
Yeah.
Definitely. I know I wanted to interview Tess Gallagher for this book, who lives here in Washington.
Right.
And
I wanted to interview Stephen Dunn, who lives in California. And so there's so many other projects, but we don't want to do the joy for the reader as well as for us of the Writers Library is that we were face to face with these writers. Right. And, we inhabited the same space. And so I think doing a Zoom interview would not have the same immediacy. Jeff disagrees with me. So.
Well, I don't disagree. I just would sort of take it any way I could get it, in a way. And, I feel like a lot of people, I think, very isolated during this time. So the prospect of doing interviews now appeals to me, but I, certainly agree that there's something very special about going to people's homes, and I loved going to people's homes. So that's certainly far preferable, but it does mean that we won't be doing one of these books anytime soon. I would say 2022 is the earliest we could expect to do interviews, and then the book wouldn't come out till 2023
or 4.
Yeah. So, it's going to be a while before we do another one.
Well, I'll just put out the thought that poetry is about the spoken word, and more than anything. So it seems like it would translate okay to Zoom. I want to read a little excerpt from Susan Orlean, who wrote the foreword for the author of the library book. Okay, so why do books seem so human, so personal? What makes them feel almost alive, as if a book is a person sitting right beside us, whispering a marvelous story in our ear? This is the same question that propelled Nancy Pearl and Jeff Schwager to undertake the Writer's Library, asking writers what books whispered most persistently in their ears. So I think that's pretty true, what you've done and what you've accomplished with this book. It's amazing. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Tess, should we do questions now? Quick Q&A? Tess?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Shall we chat more, or is it a good time for?
We have a little more time if you'd like to chat more. Otherwise, we can go to Q&A if you don't have any questions left.
Oh, I think we should do Q&A.
Great. Let's open it up.
My vote.
I have more questions, but we can do Q&A.
Raise hand feature. You can ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom.
Or Lillian, while we're waiting, you could ask another.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you and Jeff, what you hope readers take away from this book, what you hope librarians take away from this book. Is there anything, I mean, it's glorious, right? But is there anything you have in mind that you would like librarians or readers to take away from this glorious book?
Well, there's a wonderful display up at Finney Books that has the Writer's Library and then many of the books that were recommended by the writers. And one of the things that perhaps we didn't make clear is that at the end of each interview, we pulled out about 10 titles from the interviews. So what I hope is that people will use this as a guide to help them find new books to read, books that authors they haven't heard of. Certainly there are authors that we hadn't heard of, books we hadn't read that guided us in our reading while we were working on this book.
Yeah, and just the incredible breadth of what's available and what will influence you over the course of your life if you want to be a writer or if you're a reader. So many different books are named by different writers. There's a lot of overlap, but there's also a lot of books that are unique to one interview. And I think, people will find just so many great titles in here. And you'll find, just if a writer's talking especially passionately about how much they love a book in here, it might influence you to read that book that you would never have occurred to you otherwise. Yeah. And that's really the greatest thing that I think people can get out of this book.
Yeah. Did you both recommend books to the authors when you were talking to them? I bet that was fun.
Yes.
I'm sure we did. I know my favorite recommendation that I gave someone was to Susan Choi. We were talking about Philip Roth, as we always seem to be with these writers, and she was saying that she had just read Everyman, which is one of the short novels Roth wrote towards the end of his life. And I said, well, have you read Nemesis, his final novel? She was at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and Roth's book took place at a summer camp during a polio epidemic. And I said, you should really read this. It was his last book, but it's so powerful and so good. And Susan went out the next day and bought a copy, and then she and I corresponded about it afterwards. And that book is a great book for people looking for books to read now. It's about this polio epidemic in New Jersey, fictional. But it will remind you of certain things that are going on in our society today.
What's the title of it?
Nemesis.
Okay.
There are many books called Nemesis out there. This is my favorite.
Okay. All right. Nancy, did you make any recommendations? I know you did.
I did. But I did, but we have some interesting questions to answer.
Oh, okay.
Well, our first question is from Sean, and it's for Nancy and Jeff. What books whispered in your ear to make you want to write?
And I know Jeff has a good answer for that.
Well, so many books have made me want to write. Certainly Philip Roth's books, Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson, Alice Munro's short stories are something that I return to constantly. I find that her stories, more than anyone else's, pack the punch of a novel in each one of her stories. The way she compresses events, the way she defies linear time, really always draws me in, but always makes me want to be able to do what she does, and while knowing that I would never be able to do what she does. Nancy?
Well, yeah, after Alice Munro, anybody else would sound a little minor, I think. So the books that meant the most to me, I think, and that really defined the kind of writing that I wanted to do and the kind of reading, the kind of books that I love, were books that I read as a young teenager by a writer named Mary Stolz, S-T-O-L-Z. And there were novels written in a stream of consciousness style for teens. And really, two of them, they're all out of print, but two of them that I still, I remember all of them and could tell you the plots of all of them, but the two that I think are so wonderful is one is called In a Mirror, and the other is called Second Nature. And just for confusion's sake, Mary Stolz wrote a book for younger kids called Cat in a Mirror, but ignore that cat part, and you just want a book called In a Mirror. So those are.
Actually, I want to add one more writer who really, because I've done a little work as a playwright as well, a writer who really inspired me was August Wilson, born in Pittsburgh, but ended his life here in Seattle for I think the last decade of his life. And I was lucky enough to interview him twice when I was a young journalist. And he wrote, for those who don't know, he wrote a series of plays set one in each decade of the 20th century, focusing on the African-American experience. And the dialogue in those plays is so amazing. He's just phenomenal. In terms of the capturing the musicality that dialogue can have, nobody since Shakespeare, to me, in English has done as well as August Wilson. And I just have to shout out to him. And I think his wife and daughter may still live here in town. And Charles Johnson, who was interviewed in the book, was a very close friend of August Wilson's. And we got to talk to him a bit about August Wilson during the interview. And gosh, what a writer. So for playwrights out there, you could do no better for yourself than to read August Wilson's work.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a really great recommendation. And it's actually interesting that you mentioned Philip Roth, because our next question is to Jeff, and it's, what's your favorite Philip Roth book?
Oh, God, I love them all. No, I don't love them all, actually. I was just telling Nancy the other day that I don't love The Great American Novel, his baseball book. Well, Portnoy's Complaint is the funniest. Goodbye, Columbus is perhaps the most poignant. The Human Stain had an amazing topicality to it. It was a book about political correctness. It's a book about an African-American man who passes as white throughout his career. And when one day there are these two students who have never shown up to his lectures, he says, who are these spooks? Meaning ghosts. But because the students in question happen to be black, and this man the professor doesn't realize that, he's accused of racism, but he's spent his whole life passing as white and doesn't want to say, how could I, you can't accuse me of racism, I'm black. And that was a really amazing book. Of course, American Pastoral, which won the Pulitzer Prize, but someone was out, the question was my favorite, right? One of those, I guess, is my favorite.
On a deserted island, that would be it.
Yeah, I mean, Portnoy's complaint, because I'd be looking for a laugh. If I was alone on a desert island, I would definitely need laughs.
Thank you. Our next question is from Kimberly, and she asks, did any of the authors lobby you to interview another author? And if yes, were you tempted?
You know, that didn't really happen. I think that some authors, you know, would talk about other authors. And Jeff and I would think, oh, you know, maybe wouldn't it have been nice to interview Charles Simic, for example, who's a poet that Russell Banks mentioned, and so did Jane Hirschfield. But there wasn't any of that, you know, pressure to interview anybody.
No, but I would follow each of the writers on Twitter when they agreed to do the interview so that I could just familiarize myself with them more. And when I was reading Laila Lalami's Twitter feed, she mentioned her friend Maza Mengiste. And as it happened, we wanted to interview Maza for the book. And so we wrote Laila asking her if she would introduce us to Maza and perhaps help lobby Maza on our behalf. And indeed that did happen, and Maza ended up being the very last interview I believe we did in the book, because The Shadow King had just been published at that moment, and you know, we were wowed by it and really wanted to get her in the book. So that worked out great. So close to a yes to that question.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions coming in. Lillian, do you have any other questions?
Maybe. Oh, yes. The Writers' Library is going to be an audiobook. And will some of the authors be reading their interviews, or how is that going to work?
Well, it's already done.
Okay.
The book is done. 5 of the authors all had the opportunity to read their own interviews, and 5 of the authors decided that they wanted to do it. And I'm going to try to remember the 5. Lori Frankel, Vendela Vida, Luis Urrea, and 2 others.
Okay.
Sari Hustvedt.
Oh, Sari Hustvedt.
Oh, wonderful.
And 1 other then. And Jeff and I get to read. It was a very difficult audiobook to put together. So Jeff and I both read our questions. You know, we sat in the recording studio and separately on separate days and just read our questions in each of the interviews, and then they had to put the author's answers with that. And then the other writers are all read by voice actors.
Okay.
The 5th one, by the way, who read his own stuff was Richard Ford.
Oh,
Okay.
Richard Ford, right.
Yeah,
Right.
which was a surprise. I mean, it was interesting to see who agreed to do it and who didn't. And there were a couple of other writers who wanted to do it from their home, but HarperCollins felt it needed to be done in a studio. But because of COVID, the writers didn't want to leave their home to go to a studio. And I suspect others might have done it as well if we weren't in the weird times that we're in.
Right.
And in fact, I really wanted to do it with Nancy so that we could at least get that sense of rhythm between us. That was so much fun during the actual interviews, but the studio wouldn't allow us to do it. They would only allow one of us in the recording booth at a time.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure it'll be wonderful. Yeah.
We hope so.
Yeah. And
wait, Lillian, let me just say, and plus, for those people who do want the audiobook, there's added content in the audiobook. There's an excerpt from Laila Lalami's interview and an excerpt from Michael Chabon's and Ayelet Waldman's interview in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yes.
That's a nice little teaser.
Yeah.
So, and I wanted to make mention of your signed book plates that you have. They'll, if anybody wants a signed book plate to put in their book that they're going to purchase from either Elliott Bay or Finney Books or wherever, you email admin@nancypearl.com and you'll send them a book plate.
Yes.
Right. A signed book plate.
Right. And if you want it, personalized, just let me know and we'll personalize it to whomever.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
So that's in the chat in case you didn't get the email address.
Yes, I just put it back again in the chat. And I also put in the link to the book at Elliott Bay Books. And if you're a Folio member and you're picking up the book, you can still get your Folio discount. So that's pretty cool. And it's also available everywhere else books are sold, of course.
Yes, of course. All right. No other questions?
No other questions so far.
Right. Do you have any questions for me? No, I'm just kidding.
Tell us about Nancy Pearl. What's she really like?
Well, she is, I tell you, I'm the chairman of the Nancy Pearl fan club. That's been going on for 20 plus years. So, yeah.
Well, just like in the other interviews, when I had to make Jeff stop asking questions, I feel like maybe there's a natural end to interviews. And this might be it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it was wonderful.
You both here, and thank you so much, Lillian, for interviewing.
Oh, my pleasure, really.
I look forward
Thank you so much for having us.
Oh, thank you for being here. And everybody go out and buy this book because it's amazing. It's amazing. Is it backwards?
No.
Okay. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Tess. Thank you, Lillian.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.